Well, hello, Andrew again, and this is episode 183. Today we're continuing in Matthew chapter 25. It's the last part of it. I think it is anyway. And again, Jesus talking about the end, but also talking about the issue of judgment. And so we pick it up. It's the parable of the sheep and the goats, but it's more than a parable, I think. So Matthew chapter 25 verses 31 to 46. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you as a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or naked or sick or in prison or a stranger, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." This is an uncomfortable parable. At least I hope that you felt as uncomfortable as you heard it as I do when I read it. It certainly causes me a measure of squirminess. I want to suggest that this is a good thing. It alerts me to the reality that my conscience is not completely seared and inactive. And it also invites us to be open to the opportunities to make a difference in small ways that the Lord puts before us in the everyday. I'll return to this shortly. It seems to me that there are two primary ways of reading this parable. It's not necessarily a case of choosing one over the other. I think we can do both. And in my view, both are true and both have something to say. There is the political and there is the personal. The political starts with a recognition that Jesus stresses, and I'll just read the text again, verse 32, "All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats." Well, the people isn't there. It more literally reads, and I'll just put this in the way that it flows, "and will be assembled before him all the nations, and he will separate them from one another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and will set the sheep on the right of him, and the goats on the left." So that's a more literal reading of the verse, and it's about the nations being assembled before him, the ethnos. And this generally, doesn't always, but refers to the other nations. And so that the nations will be assembled, and the nations will be sorted, the sheep and the goats. Now it does present problems later on when we come to the issue of judgment or reward, and I'm not going to deal with that today, yet it still deserves our consideration as a political as a political issue. The nations are judged on how they behave towards their neighbours, and I would suggest toward their own people. Now, I have no wish to offend anybody with the language I'm about to use. When the leader of the most powerful nation on the planet describes poor nations as shithole countries and bends all his power to prevent access by people from those countries to the land of the free, to the extent that there are now 545 children separated from their parents, who were separated from their parents at the border, many of them in nappies at the time, and are now not able to be reunited with their parents because the government which took them does not know who their parents are, or where, or even if they can be found. This is telling you something about that most powerful nation. A nation which, according to this parable, though it believes itself to be the most moral and righteous, will stand under the judgment of God. If you think I'm upset about this, you're right. I am. This is one aspect of the treatment of the least of these that Jesus is talking about. It happens within nations also, including our own, where the least of us are clearly identifiable. And rather than being supported and giving a hand up to become fully functioning citizens, are so often vilified and kept down. When we no longer have the least of us, because all are treated with fairness, with compassion, with dignity and respect, and given what they need to take their place as fully functioning members of society, we will know that the kingdom of heaven has indeed come. I'm realistic to enough to recognise, though, that given our fallenness, it's not going to happen this side of Jesus returning as the King of Kings and Prince of Peace. This does not mean, however, that it's not something that his people should not be advocating and working toward. We should. The second and more obvious way of reading what this text puts before us is that this is a personal responsibility. It's easy to simply read it as an invitation to greater awareness of the people around us, seeing through the eyes of compassion and kindness, and responding accordingly. At base, because we hate feeling guilty by our own inaction, yet hopefully ultimately driven by a deeper and a higher ethic of compassion and wanting to see someone else's life lifted and improved. Yet there is more to be seen here. What this parable, and I think it is partly a parable, ultimately points to is a kingdom of heaven view of how things ultimately will be. In the kingdom of heaven living, there are no untouchables, no people unworthy of love, dignity and respect. In the kingdom there are no least. To suggest that there are means that we have already made a judgment about the deservingness or otherwise of individuals or groups of people. I want you to think about this. When we think about the least, we've made a judgment. It may be a judgment based on the ways we perceive they behave, the food they eat, the politics they espouse, the colour of their skins, their tastes in music, their claimed sexuality, where they live, the way they get around, the way they dress, how they cut their hair or trim their beards, the money or lack of it in their bank accounts, their educational achievements or lack thereof, and what schools they went to, their employment status, the church they go to, or the alternative religions that they practice. The list could go on. Add your own favourite prejudice. Anything that identifies others as other or lesser becomes fruitful ground for our judgment, our dislike, our lack of compassion and concern. In case you're thinking I'm just getting just at you, you're wrong. I see these negative judgmental attributes in myself also. It's this text that is awakening me yet again to them. As is so often in my speaking, I'm preaching to myself. All the things that Jesus attributes to us as goats, as things that we have not done, ultimately reflects both on our judgment of others as being less than deserving, or on our own hearts as simply lacking in compassion. It's sobering, isn't it, to think of it in these terms. Well, I hope it's useful. God bless you.